Here I'll show you an easy way to apply formulas and functions to every so many rows in Excel. So let's say we've got a list like this and you want to either have a cell reference the list every so many rows or perform some sort of function on that list. And even better, I'll show you how to do it without these annoying spaces, so it's going to save you a step. So I've got two examples of that over here, and we don't have to use an array formula for any of it. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. So I've got a few different examples here, and the first set use the mod function. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways to set the intervals in the first two examples. Then we're going to go ahead and apply the average function. So I will show you how to do that. And then after that, we'll do the, I guess, slightly more complicated formula, which is going to make it so you don't have to have any spaces here. And you may notice the zero and the division errors right here. Don't worry about that. Towards the end of the tutorial, I'll show you a super simple, easy way to get rid of those. If you don't want to wait until then, just use the if error function. All right, so let's get started. Here's our list. Just a sample list of numbers, nothing special, but we want to do something every so many intervals. So the very first function, the very first formula we're going to use is the mod. You may notice we have an if statement, we have a mod function, and a row function. Now what we want to pull from the inside of this out is this right here. Oops, the mod function. So the mod function is an awesome function that can be easily confusing, but it does not have to be. All right, so let's put the example right here. Copy it down so you can see what we get. So the mod function is the modulus operator. All that it does is it divides two numbers, or it divides one number by another number, and it returns a remainder. And doing this allows us to figure out an interval. So if we divide by 3, every 3 rows we will get a 0. So that's how we use this awesome little trick to figure out which cell we're in, and therefore to apply whatever formula or function we want. Now we do that, let me zoom in a little bit more here. We use another really cool thing. We use the row function. If you use the row function without any arguments, it returns the current row. So just real quick, up here equals row, enter. Of course, you're being annoying, equals row. There we go. We're in row 1, it returns 1. Row 2 returns 2, row 3 returns 3, and so on. So this right here, since we're in row 2, returns 2. Then we subtract 1. 2 minus 1 is 1. 1 divided by 3 is not going to come out nicely, so there's going to be a remainder. So the next part of this is we have to make this equal true or false. We use a very simple comparison operator. What you can do, any function, all you have to do to make it output true or false is go equals, and then what do you want to test it for? I want to see if it equals 0. Do you equal 0? Well, it should equal false now. Nope. This will equal false. This will equal true. So false, false, true, false, false, true. So now that we have that, we can combine it with an if statement. So if, now we have our logical test because it must evaluate to true or false. And if it equals true, I want to return that cell. If it does not equal true, do nothing. And that is how we get this formula. So we use the row function to return the current row. We use the mod function to do some division and tell us if there's a remainder or not. We use a comparison operator right here. Figure out what we want to compare it to, which will be 0 when you're using the mod function in this fashion. And then what do you want to do if it is the correct interval? What do you want to do if it is not? Now let's move on to the second example where I will cover this -1 in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this column. I just used it to show you how to build this. All right. So here, if we look up to the formula bar, watch when I go between the two, this one and this one, you will see that only one number changes. After the row function, it goes from -1 to -2. But look at the difference in the data set. So remember, for the mod function, we are trying to figure out a number to use for our division. Here we use the current row number, which is 2, and we subtract 1. So 2 minus 1 is 1. And that's what makes it so that it goes only for the third row right here. However, if we want it to start in the first row, we need to offset it such that this first number equals 0. So the offset number here, the -2 or the -1, is based on which row you have it in. Since I have this in row 2, I must subtract 2 in order to make this number equal 0 so that we can get a value in the very first cell, the very first row of our data set. And as you can imagine, the 3, which is the same for both examples, this is the interval. So we change that to whatever interval we want. Let's change it to 4. Copy it down. And so every 4 rows. It's exactly the same for this guy and this guy. So really all you need to do is figure out if you want it to start on the first row or not, which determines if you minus the current row's number, and then the interval right here. And when I say minus the current row's number, I'm sorry, I mean to minus the number of the very first row of the data set, because you'll see that this number stays the same the whole way down. It does not change. But of course, we're not subtracting 4 or 3. We're only subtracting the number of the first row of the data set. Okay. And then, of course, this one is 1 less than the first row of the data set. All right. I took a little bit of time on that because I know it can get confusing for people. But now let's speed it up. We're going to go to the third example right here. We're going to actually use a formula and a function on these cells. We're going to use a range. Now everything here is the same as this formula here, except for where we have A2 here. Well, actually, let me change this back to 3. Okay, and copy you down. So where we have A2 right here, we are going to have this guy right here. And this is just a function with relative cell references. Now, this wouldn't necessarily work so well with this example here because we would have to have a cell referencing values above it. But with this example, our cells only reference data below it. So when I click it, you can see that the average is A2 to A4, A2 to A4. If I did it referencing cells above it, it'd go off the worksheet and cause some errors. So in the next examples where I say the no spaces for the columns over here, I will show you a much more robust way to apply formulas and functions to columns, although it might seem a little bit more challenging to do it that way, so I want to show you this. So as long as we're going to be referencing cells below it, such as A2 to A4, then we just copy the formula down as before. Make sure that you, like before, make sure that you keep these cell references relative, so no dollar signs in front of them, and you can apply whatever formula or function you want, doesn't matter. And it's going to apply every 3. So we go down here, perfect, go down here, perfect. And of course these cells in between are going to output nothing because they do not meet our criteria using the modulus function. So that's how that works. It's not too difficult once you kind of start to understand how to use the mod function. That's usually where most of the confusion is. But now that I've showed you how to do it this way, let me get these guys out of the way and let's go to some cooler examples. So let's say that we do not want any spaces in anything. All right, I'm just going to shrink these guys, make life easier. Okay, so you can see that this right here is exactly the same as mod 2. It's just that instead of having all these blanks or what look like blanks and then going down to the next number, we have them nice, neat, easy, awesome, right there, and no array formula. So let's take a closer look at this guy. We're going to use this magical function, the offset function. It is so awesome. And the better you get with Excel, the more you're going to use this function. It returns a range reference. That range reference can be a single cell, or it can be a range of multiple cells, so A2 to A4, A2 to A5, whatever you want it to be. In this example, it's going to work on a single cell. Let me zoom in a little bit more, actually. This function can be a little tough. So what we do first is we figure out our reference cell. This is always going to be the first cell in the data set, and you are going to want to put dollar signs around it. You don't want it to move. This is our data set, cell A2. We click it, we put dollar signs in front of the column and the row. That way when we copy the formula, it does not ever change. So this is our reference for offsetting our data. Now, this next argument is how many rows we would like to offset that data. So how many rows down, you can actually go up, but in this example, we're only going down. How many rows down do we want to go from this reference? And this is where all the magic happens, which I'll cover shortly. The next one is how many columns would you like to go to the right or left? You can leave that blank. I'm going to put it as a 0 so it's not confusing later, because we want to go 0 columns to the right and 0 columns to the left. The next one is the height. This is a particularly interesting one. That's going to say, okay, you've offset this cell A2 by so many rows here. Now, how high do you want the range reference to be? Do you want it to be 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cell, 4 cells? Well, in this example, we're simply going to return a value, so we only want the height of the range reference to be a single cell, 1 cell. So, A2. So this first example should return A2. The next example should go down here and return A4, or which one is it? A5, I guess, and so on. Now let's go to the tricky section, which is our offset. This is our offset. It is pretty darn interesting. Let me copy it and get it out of here. I'm going to be using the row function quite a lot today. Equals. So here you can see that our offset is 0. Our offset is 3, 6, 9, 12, and so on. It's what you would expect it to be. So it goes by every 3 rows. Now how does that work? Well, first we get a reference to the current row. That would be 2 in this case. Now we want to subtract the very first row of our data set. This value will never change because we have dollar signs in front of it. But remember, row without an argument will change to be the value of the current row. So this is the value that changes for every row. Right now it's 2. In row 3, it'll be 3, then 4, 5, and so on. So right now this is 2. Then we subtract the row of the first row of our data set, which is 2. That equals 0. And the 3 here is the interval. So every 3 rows. So now we have a 0, or we have a 2 minus a 2, which equals 0 times 3. 0 times any number is 0. So we get 0. Down here, we get 3 minus 2, which equals 1 times 3, and that's how we get 3. This is 2, this is 3, and so on. So this dude right here determines our offset for the rows right here, and that's how we get that. Put it all together, and it comes out to give us a lovely range reference. Now, one thing I want to do, it's really, really cool, and it'll help you understand formulas and functions. Select a cell with a formula in it, go to the Formulas tab, and click Evaluate Formula. Once you are here, let me zoom in. You can go through the formula. You can see what the formula sees in its calculations. Now, it's not completely perfect, but it's pretty darn helpful. So whatever is underlined is what's going to be executed the moment I click Evaluate. So we are right now in row 2. So when I click Evaluate, row right there will become 2. What is the row for A2? That's 2. 2 minus 2, 0. 0 times 3. Well, there we go. 0 and then 0 times 3. 0. So this is what the offset function looks like before it calculates. We have A2 as a reference cell. We want to offset it by 0 rows and by 0 columns, and we want it to be 1 cell high, which returns A2. Or it returns the value in A2. And click restart if you want to go through it again. Just an awesome little thing to do. So click the cell with the formula, go to the formulas tab, and evaluate formula. Now let's go ahead and do a function. So functions are what we really want. Let's do the average function. This one's a little bit different than the mod. The mod, all we had to do was change A2 and plug in whatever the hell we wanted there. Here, what we're going to do is we have to surround the offset by the function that we want. So remember, offset returns a range reference. So any formula or function that's going to utilize a range reference, we can just pop offset in there, create our range however we want to create it, and the surrounding function will use that range the same as if you typed it in by hand. Now there are a couple differences with the offset function here, and I would like to quickly cover those. Shouldn't be too difficult to explain them to you at this point. So let's say here, remember, so this stays the same. We choose our interval 3. If you want to change the interval, change that number. That's all you have to change. If you want to change the range, so here we return 1 cell. In the next example, we want to return more than 1 cell. We change the 1. So that will change the height of the range reference that it returns. So instead of returning A2, it could return A2 to A3, or range A2 to A4, and so on. So here, in our offset function, here we go, we have A2, just like before. We have all of this just like before, exactly the same. We want to do something every 3 rows, but we change the 1 to a 3. That makes it so that the average will work on cell A2 to A4, and then so on. It'll go down. So it'll return a range of multiple cells. We can see this when we go to formulas, evaluate formula, and let's click through it. So row, that's 2, row A2, 2, 2 minus 2 is 0, 0 times 3 is 0. So we have offset A2, 0, 0, 3, hit evaluate, and it returns a range reference of A2 to A4. So we have cell A2, A3, and A4. So 3 cells included in that range reference. And what you can see here, which is really cool, when we did the offset function before, it just returned the value when we went to evaluate the offset function itself. When you surround that function with another function, like the average function, we get to see the actual range reference that the offset function returns. So it's kind of cool to see how that works. And we can, so it's A2 to A4 here, and we can see, if we close this, go to the next one, evaluate formula, evaluate 3 minus 2 is 1, 1 times 3 is 3, offset returns A5 to A7. So it's an awesome function. We don't have to use array formulas. We don't have to use any complex formulas or overly complex functions. We just need to learn the offset function. And when you get stuck, go to the Formulas tab and click Evaluate Formula. Once you've selected the cell with the formula, click Evaluate Formula, and then go through the steps there to see how it works. That's really going to save you in a lot of situations where maybe you haven't used it for a month and you forget how it works. But really, offset function combined with a row function is a lifesaver. Now actually, before I forget, I did tell you I was going to show you how to get rid of these errors. So obviously, when we copy it down to the whole data set, you're going to have a bunch of cells that don't need anything. So what you can do there is just use the if error function. So you just surround it with if error, and then the first argument for that is what you input into the cell, and then you do a comma, and the next argument is what you want to output if there is an error, and then you close it. Now, I don't think, yeah, this returns 0, so it's not going to be such an issue. Just take off the zeros if you don't want, or you can surround it with another if statement that will go ahead and take care of it if it is 0. But down here where we have actual errors, that's where this will shine. And there we go. So that's all there is for this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot, and make sure to go ahead and download this sample workbook so that you don't have to type all this stuff out by hand. You can just copy, paste it, and use it as you need to in your own worksheet. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.